to Student Progressive Bain and to the Middle East Law Association and to the other student organizations who invited me here tonight. I'm really delighted to be in Madison. I was happy to accept the invitation. It's a little bit odd to be talking about political issues on the day after an election that isn't directly about the election itself. But personally, after having been subjected to hour after hour after hour of mind-numbing cable news chatter, followed by a day of really predictable and trite analysis about what it all means, I'm actually really relieved to be talking about something other than the election, and I hope you are as well. You probably have heard anyway that we are a center-right nation, that Obama, if he wants to preserve his presidency, has to move even further to the right, which you may not have known is actually possible, that he has to accommodate more Republican ideas. So if you haven't heard that, you have now, and you're completely caught up on what the meaning of this election is, at least as far as the establishment press sees it. Which is actually quite odd because the people who have been following that advice for their entire decades, who are called, or who call themselves blue dogs, actually bore the brunt of the electoral bloodbath last night, which is worthy of applause on its own. But nonetheless, the thing that they were doing for the last several decades, which is trying to make themselves as conservative as possible, as indistinguishable from Republicans as possible, according to the received wisdom of the media, is what Obama and the Democrats need to do even more of, even though the people who have been doing that for the last several decades got slaughtered last night. Somehow that makes sense in a lot of people's minds. So in any event, that's the conventional wisdom about last night's election. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about the election in the question and answer session, but let me focus on the topic that we've convened to actually discuss, which is terrorism and civil liberties in the age of Obama. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to say about this topic and the kinds of things that we ought to examine, the first thing I realized is that there's actually a lack of clarity in terms of what these concepts even refer to. And so I thought it would be a good idea, before talking about specifically what Obama has and hasn't done and how terrorism and civil liberties interact with one another, to first take a step back and try and question what we mean by these key terms. And what really strikes me as both interesting and important is that we use these terms all the time, and yet I don't think they really do have very clear or specific meaning, at least in terms of how they're used. And what's even more interesting, at least to me, is that if you look at the two terms that I want to focus on, civil liberties and terrorism, there's actually a paradox involved, because one of those terms is actually something that we probably all think is sort of unclear and difficult to define, and yet in reality is extremely clear. While the other term is probably one that we think is very clear, and that most people would say is very clear and easy to understand, and yet it is extremely unclear, in fact, impoverished of any meaning at all. So let's start with civil liberties, that term. That's a term that I think is familiar to most people. When you say it, they've heard of it before. They sort of know what it references, but I think most people would have a very hard time describing what that actually means. What's the definition of civil liberties? What does it actually refer to? And I know for me, who is somebody who writes about civil liberties at least as much as, if not more than any other topic, I too would have had a hard time defining what it even means before I actually began thinking about it in a sort of rigorous way. And what I actually found is that the term is crystal clear in terms of what it denotes and what it refers to. So my understanding of civil liberties is that it is the constraints that we have placed on the government in terms of how the government can and cannot exercise its power. So put another way, it's really a list of things that we have told the government you may not do when you exercise power in terms of how you treat us. And that to me seems like an extremely clear concept. It's the citizenry getting together and telling the government these are the things that you cannot do. And what makes this concept even clearer is the fact that this list of things that we've told the government you cannot do is not one that we need to figure out or divine or sit around and debating much, because there's actually a document that contains that list and it says exactly what those are, and that document is the Constitution. And that's what the Constitution is for. The Constitution is a document that sets forth the things that the government is barred from doing in terms of how it exercises its power when it is dealing with us, the citizenry. And not only is there a document that lets you know exactly what this list is, which I think enhances the clarity of what civil liberties mean, but the list itself is actually quite clear. You can go and start at the Bill of Rights and you can read them, and there's some terms in there that may be subject to debate and may have some ambiguity in them, but by and large the terms are quite clear. The prohibitions are very easy to understand. And what makes this concept clearer still is that in order to understand what these civil liberties are, you look at what the Constitution was intended to do. And what the Constitution was intended to do is to take this list of prohibitions on what the government is permitted to do and remove them from the political process, to protect them and immunize them from political debate and compromise and trade-offs and being subject to the kinds of considerations that all other political issues are subject to. So it's not just a list that exists of civil liberties, it's really the defining list of what our government was intended to be, of who we are as a people politically, of what our political identity is. It's really the starting point, the foundation for understanding everything else about politics. And that to me is an important thing to note right at the outset, which is if you ask people what are civil liberties, how do you understand civil liberties, including people who are receptive to what they think is the agenda behind it, I think a lot of people would think, well, it's this sort of side issue. It's this kind of exotic boutique of interest that a narrow segment of the population is interested in defending. It's the sort of thing that pops up when some Nazis want to march through a community filled with Holocaust survivors, or some student wears a provocative t-shirt with a political or religious message, or the president decides that there's some awful, evil monster terrorist far away that we never have to see who he wants to kill. Then civil liberties becomes relevant. It's sort of in this weird, extreme, rare case that these kind of issues matter. The ACLU gets involved. A few other sort of people on the fringe like me start writing about it and talking about it and caring about it. And that, I think, is what most people understand civil liberties to be, and exactly the opposite is true. It's not a side issue, it's not secondary, it's not ancillary to who we are, it's absolutely central. And the way that you can know that is if you look at what the founders talked about and debated and thought most about when they formed the country that we now call the United States. They didn't talk all that much about economic policy or the distribution of resources or tax issues or what the capital gains rate ought to be. They talked a little bit about that. They cared about that. That was of interest to them. But the thing that really preoccupied them, that engulfed their interest, that really commanded their attention far more than anything else, was what this list would be. What would the list be of things that the government was prohibited from doing? And it's not hard to understand why that was true. I mean, if you look at how the country was founded, they had just waged an extraordinarily dangerous and difficult and risky war against what was then the greatest empire on earth in order to free themselves from a system in which this list didn't exist, or at least it didn't exist nearly to the extent that they thought that it should. And so the central question that they sought to answer when they created these documents that form the country that we still live in and under which we exercise all of what we think are our rights, the central question that it was intended to answer was, well, if we create this government that is vested with the power to do all sorts of things to us, to take our money, to put us in cages, to charge us with crimes, to investigate us, to search our houses, how can we prevent this extraordinarily powerful entity from essentially replicating the abuses that we just waged war to free ourselves from? And the answer was, the only way that we can do that is by creating a list that we all agree to that tells the government that no matter what happens, no matter how many people want you to do these things, here is the list of the things that you are not permitted to do. And that is the list of what we now call civil liberties. And you don't even have to go back to the founding. You can even look at what I'm sure is your own childhood if you grew up in the United States and were educated here about the reasons that you were told / instructed / propagandized, whatever verb you want to use, that the United States is better than all other countries. If you think about the reasons that we were told in childhood that we were more free and that we were better than the Soviet Union and tyrannies and the like, the reason wasn't because we're more economically prosperous than all the other countries, which is a good thing that that's not the basis, since we're actually not any longer. And it wasn't because we have a better tax code or because we have a better healthcare system or anything like that. What we were told is that the reason what makes us better is that there are things that the government in our country is prohibited from doing, which in other countries, those bad tyrannies over there, they're actually free to do. The government can't put you into prison unless it charges you with a crime and convicts you of guilt in front of a jury of your peers. That the president is just as bound by the law as every other citizen and is not permitted to break it, and if he does, he will be held just as accountable. That we have free speech and free press, so that no matter what opinions you express, no matter how offensive they are, the government can't do things to you that would constitute a punishment. These are the things that we're told that made us better, that made us different, that formed the identity of what the American political consciousness is all about. So even today, we still recognize, even if consciously we don't say it, that what is at the center of our political culture are not these other issues that tend to get a lot more attention, but are actually this list of things that the government is prohibited from doing, our constitutional rights, our civil liberties. And the final point I want to make about why this term is so clear, about what accounts for the clarity of them, is that they're expressed in terms that are absolute. They're not conditional. They don't apply in some of the cases, at some points, or sometimes depending on certain circumstances. They're absolute. They exist unconditionally. I remember I had this exchange once that wasn't particularly